Dante Harris and Malik Jefferson were not just criminals, they were Seattle's most feared predators. A duo whose calculated murders left an entire city paralyzed with fear. From cryptic envelopes to meticulously planned killings, their reign of terror exposed the dark side of obsession, revenge, and betrayal. Seattle had always been known for its iconic skyline, misty waterfronts, and the constant drizzle that painted its streets gray. The city's image was of peaceful neighborhoods, bustling coffee shops, and quiet parks where families strolled safely. But in early 2019, a darkness began to creep into the heart of the city, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, until it erupted into something terrifying. The first reports came from the northern districts. A young woman's body was discovered in a dimly lit alley, her life brutally cut short. The scene was gruesome, with no clear motive, no signs of struggle, and no apparent reason why she had been targeted. Residents were shocked, questioning the safety of their city for the first time in decades. Within weeks, another murder was reported, this time in the South District. A middle-aged man, a local artist, was found dead in his studio. Police noticed a chilling similarity. Both victims had received a black envelope days before their deaths. The envelopes contained no threatening words, no obvious instructions, just cryptic symbols and strange handwriting. At first, authorities dismissed it as coincidence, but as the number of murders slowly grew, it became clear that something much more sinister was at play. People began whispering about a killer who did not just strike randomly, but who planned each move meticulously. The city's sense of normalcy started to crumble. Parents stopped letting their children play outside alone, and local businesses saw fewer customers in the evenings. News channels ran continuous updates, heightening fear with every new report. People who had once walked the streets without concern now looked over their shoulders at every shadow. Even the police, trained to handle the worst of crimes, admitted they had never encountered anything like this. The envelopes remained a mystery, and the cryptic symbols inside baffled even experts in handwriting and codes. Each murder seemed to carry a hidden message, a puzzle that only the killer understood. Detectives began connecting the victims through subtle online interactions. Social media profiles, forums, and digital connections revealed faint patterns, intersections in their lives that seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared to link them to the killer's purpose. Investigators speculated about a personal vendetta, yet the breadth of the victims' backgrounds suggested something more calculated. The murders were not impulsive. They were deliberate, planned with the precision of a chess master thinking moves ahead. Each death created waves of unease, as neighbors realized that no one was immune, regardless of social status or lifestyle. By mid-2019, the city was on edge. Ordinary activities felt dangerous. Late-night walks and quiet streets became arenas of fear. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious black envelopes and the curious black envelopes, and the audacity of a killer or killers who seemed untouchable. The pattern was clear, yet frustratingly vague, leaving both the public and law enforcement struggling to understand what came next. Seattle, a city once known for rain-soaked tranquility, had become the hunting ground of an unseen predator. The terror was not just in the murders themselves, but in the anticipation, the psychological grip that the unknown assailant had on the entire population. Fear had taken root, and the city would never look at its quiet streets the same way again. The sense of dread only grew as weeks passed without resolution. The police urged caution, but the envelopes kept appearing, leaving families terrified of the next knock on the door. Every alley, every dimly lit corner seemed suspect. Residents spoke of sleepless nights, constantly imagining shadows moving outside their windows. The city had entered a state of collective anxiety, and it was clear that the darkness enveloping Seattle was just beginning. The black killers had arrived, and no one knew how far their reach would extend. As the murders continued, Seattle's police department began to realize that the killings were far from random. Each victim had some connection to the others, though the links were subtle and often hidden in plain sight. Detectives pored over social media profiles, searching for patterns in photos, posts, and digital interactions. They discovered that many of the victims had briefly crossed paths years ago at community events, online forums, or local gatherings. At first, these connections seemed insignificant, but as more victims appeared, a disturbing pattern emerged. It became evident that the killer, or killers, were not simply striking at random. They were carefully selecting their targets, each with a purpose that only the perpetrators understood. The envelopes found at the scenes continued to perplex authorities. Unlike typical threats, they contained no demands for money, no ultimatums, and no explanation. Each envelope carried a different set of cryptic symbols, strange handwriting, and abstract references that defied straightforward interpretation. Specialists in cryptography and handwriting analysis were consulted, but even they admitted the messages were unlike anything they had encountered. Some symbols appeared to mimic ancient scripts, while others seemed entirely invented. Investigators began to suspect that the envelopes themselves were as much a part of the crime as the killings, a psychological weapon meant to terrify and confuse the city. Fear began to take hold in the community. Local news outlets covered the murders extensively, highlighting the randomness and brutality of each act. Citizens who once felt secure in their homes now avoided going out at night. Friends stopped meeting at familiar coffee shops, and parents forbade their children from walking to school alone. The city's daily life was disrupted by a creeping paranoia, and even the most cautious residents felt that danger lurked around every corner. This psychological grip appeared to be exactly what the killers wanted. By remaining anonymous and leaving only cryptic clues, they turned the entire city into a stage for their sinister game. Detectives also noticed an unsettling trait about the murders. Each was carried out with meticulous precision. Entry into homes left no signs of forced locks or alarms triggered, and in some cases, security cameras captured nothing unusual. It was as though the killers were experts in stealth and evasion, able to enter and leave spaces undetected. The thought that someone could be watching, planning, and executing such crimes with this level of skill made the city increasingly tense. People began locking doors more securely, installing cameras, and even avoiding certain neighborhoods entirely. Despite all precautions, the murders continued, a reminder that these perpetrators were always a step ahead. Authorities explored motives, but each lead seemed to dissolve into more questions than answers. Some theorized revenge, others imagined a twisted form of thrill-seeking, while a few suspected a personal vendetta targeting the victim's past actions. But none of these explanations fully accounted for the meticulous planning, the cryptic messages, and the sheer audacity of the crimes. The realization slowly settled in. Seattle was facing killers who were intelligent, calculating, and not motivated solely by anger or opportunity. They were playing a game designed to keep the city in fear, and there appeared to be no predictable pattern to their next move. As investigators dug deeper into the victims' lives, they found that the killers had studied them carefully. Social media activity, minor conflicts, old disputes, and even friendships were scrutinized. It was as if the murders were the final step in a long, calculated plan that had been years in the making. The city waited anxiously for answers, but the killers remained invisible, leaving behind only confusion, terror, and the haunting question of who would be next. As the murders continued, Seattle's police department began to realize that the killings were far from random. Each victim had some connection to the others, though the links were subtle and often hidden in plain sight. Detectives pored over social media profiles, searching for patterns in photos, posts, and digital interactions. They discovered that many of the victims had briefly crossed paths years ago at community events, online forums, or local gatherings. At first, these connections seemed insignificant, but as more victims appeared, a disturbing pattern emerged. It became evident that the killer, or killers, were not simply striking at random. They were carefully selecting their targets, each with a purpose that only the perpetrators understood. The envelopes found at the scenes continued to perplex authorities. Unlike typical threats, they contained no demands for money, no ultimatums, and no explanation. Each envelope carried a different set of cryptic symbols, strange handwriting, and abstract references that defied straightforward interpretation. Specialists in cryptography and handwriting analysis were consulted, but even they admitted the messages were unlike anything they had encountered. Some symbols appeared to mimic ancient scripts, while others seemed entirely invented. Investigators began to suspect that the envelopes themselves were as much a part of the crime as the killings, a psychological weapon meant to terrify and confuse the city. Fear began to take hold in the community. Local news outlets covered the murders extensively, highlighting the randomness and brutality of each act. Citizens who once felt secure in their homes now avoided going out at night. Friends stopped meeting at familiar coffee shops, and parents forbade their children from walking to school alone. The city's daily life was disrupted by a creeping paranoia, and even the most cautious residents felt that danger lurked around every corner. This psychological grip appeared to be exactly what the killers wanted. By remaining anonymous and leaving only cryptic clues, they turned the entire city into a stage for their sinister game. Detectives also noticed an unsettling trait about the murders. Each was carried out with meticulous precision. Entry into homes left no signs of forced locks or alarms triggered, and in some cases, security cameras captured nothing unusual. It was as though the killers were experts in stealth and evasion, able to enter and leave spaces undetected. The thought that someone could be watching, planning, and executing such crimes with this level of skill made the city increasingly tense. People began locking doors more securely, installing cameras, and even avoiding certain neighborhoods entirely. Despite all precautions, the murders continued, a reminder that these perpetrators were always a step ahead. Authorities explored motives, but each lead seemed to dissolve into more questions than answers. Some theorized revenge, others imagined a twisted form of thrill-seeking, while a few suspected a personal vendetta targeting the victim's past actions. But none of these explanations fully accounted for the meticulous planning, the cryptic messages, and the sheer audacity of the crimes. The realization slowly settled in. Seattle was facing killers who were intelligent, calculating, and not motivated solely by anger or opportunity. They were playing a game designed to keep the city in fear, and there appeared to be no predictable pattern to their next move. As investigators dug deeper into the victims' lives, they found that the killers had studied them carefully. Social media activity, minor conflicts, old disputes, and even friendships were scrutinized. It was as if the murders were the final step in a long, calculated plan that had been years in the making. The city waited anxiously for answers, but the killers remained invisible, leaving behind only confusion, terror, and the haunting question of who would be next. The murders began to escalate in both frequency and audacity, and soon the media seized upon the story, dubbing the perpetrators the Black Killers of Seattle. Unlike ordinary crimes, these murders carried a signature, a psychological imprint that left the city both horrified and fascinated. Each killing seemed carefully orchestrated to create maximum fear, not just for the victim, but for everyone who knew them. Residents became increasingly aware that the killers were watching, studying patterns, and striking when they least expected it. Ordinary routines, once comforting, now felt like traps, and even familiar streets and homes became places of danger. One of the most shocking incidents occurred in a high-rise apartment downtown. The victim, a prominent local businessman, was known for his wealth and influence, a man many assumed would be untouchable. Yet despite multiple layers of security, surveillance systems, and locked doors, he was found dead in his apartment one morning. There were no signs of forced entry, no alarm triggered, and no evidence left behind. The only clue was another black envelope left in plain sight on his desk. The symbols inside were more complex than any previously found, almost like a code meant to taunt the authorities. Investigators realized that the killers were not only clever but audacious, striking boldly where few would expect. As the police delved deeper into the victims' backgrounds, they discovered that each had been connected in some minor way years prior. But the connections were buried in the past and largely forgotten. It became clear that the killings were driven by more than mere impulse. They were carefully planned acts of revenge, orchestrated with precision and patience. The killers seemed to enjoy manipulating the narrative, leaving cryptic hints and forcing both the police and the public to try and decode their intentions. Each murder carried a message, but it was a message that no one could fully understand, deepening the fear gripping the city. Neighborhoods became increasingly tense. Citizens installed extra locks, security cameras, and alarm systems, yet the murders continued. People spoke in hushed tones about avoiding the streets at night, and many businesses altered their hours or closed entirely. The atmosphere in Seattle shifted from everyday caution to pervasive paranoia. Even those who had never been directly affected by the murders began to feel the psychological pressure. The killers were no longer just targeting individuals. They were terrorizing an entire city, controlling behavior through fear alone. Police officers and detectives grew frustrated as leads repeatedly turned cold. Surveillance footage often showed nothing unusual, and every attempt to predict the killer's next move failed. The audacity of the crimes, combined with the lack of concrete evidence, created a sense that the killers were always one step ahead. Investigators speculated that they must be highly trained, perhaps with backgrounds in military, law enforcement, or security, as their ability to bypass locks, alarms, and cameras was extraordinary. The city watched in disbelief as news reports detailed the increasingly daring acts, each one seemingly more shocking than the last. Despite the fear, a grim fascination took hold of the public. People followed every news update, studied crime scene photos, and speculated endlessly about the killers' identities and motives. The mystery deepened as more murders occurred, each victim carefully selected, each death meticulously staged, and each envelope more cryptic than the last. Seattle had become a city gripped by terror, caught between the desire for normalcy and the chilling reality that the black killers could strike at any time, anywhere, and without warning. Victims. At first glance, they seemed unrelated, different ages, backgrounds, and professions, but a closer look revealed subtle threads tying them together. The killers had studied these past events meticulously, turning minor moments into motives for deadly revenge. Authorities realized that these were not ordinary murders, fueled by sudden anger or impulse. Each killing carried a level of premeditation that suggested careful planning. The killers had chosen not only the victims, but also the circumstances of each murder to maximize fear and confusion. Homes were broken into without a trace, and every crime scene was staged to create an eerie sense of control and dominance. In some cases, victims had been lured into vulnerable positions days in advance, demonstrating that the killers had anticipated and manipulated their routines with frightening precision. The realization that these murders were calculated shook the city to its core. Investigators dug deeper into the victims' pasts and discovered connections that were both subtle and personal. There were minor betrayals, forgotten rivalries, and small acts that had been ignored at the time, but were now seen as potential triggers. It became clear that the killers were methodical and patient, waiting for years to exact their revenge. The envelopes left at each scene were part of this psychological strategy, serving not only as a signature, but also as a warning to the victims that they were being watched. The cryptic symbols inside remained unsolved, adding an additional layer of terror and mystery to the crimes. The personal nature of the murders created tension among law enforcement. Detectives struggled with the idea that the killers were not only intelligent but also deeply personal in their approach. Each victim had been chosen with a specific purpose, and the killers had ensured that every detail of the murder would leave investigators scrambling for answers. The police realized that they were dealing with individuals who had an intimate understanding of their targets' lives, capable of manipulating events from a distance while remaining undetected. The challenge was no longer just identifying the killers. It was anticipating their next move. Seattle, meanwhile, was gripped by fear and uncertainty. Communities were on edge, and residents became suspicious of even their closest neighbors. The thought that the killers had studied their victims for years meant that anyone could be next. Citizens installed security cameras, avoided unfamiliar streets, and altered their daily routines to reduce risk. Despite these precautions, the murders continued, demonstrating the killer's ability to remain elusive and control the city through fear alone. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they began to understand the psychological complexity behind the murders. These were not crimes of passion or opportunity. They were acts of carefully orchestrated revenge, executed with meticulous attention to detail. The killers had used the past as a roadmap, turning minor events into a deadly guide for their campaign. The city, once safe and predictable, now existed under the shadow of individuals who had spent years planning, waiting, and observing. Seattle had become a chessboard, and the killers were moving their pieces with terrifying precision, leaving both the public and law enforcement struggling to keep up. As the months passed, the murders continued with increasing boldness, and the city of Seattle was gripped by a sense of helplessness. The killer's ability to evade law enforcement was unlike anything the police had ever faced. Despite extensive surveillance, neighborhood patrols, and digital monitoring, the perpetrators seemed to anticipate every move. Each crime scene was left meticulously clean, with no fingerprints, footprints, or forensic evidence to track. It became clear that these were not ordinary criminals. They were highly skilled, patient, and methodical, capable of striking without leaving a trace. The city's fear intensified as the killings began occurring in more public and high-security areas. One victim was found in a small office building with locked doors and security cameras that should have captured every movement. Yet the killers had managed to bypass every obstacle, leaving only their signature black envelope as a chilling calling card. Investigators were forced to reconsider their assumptions about the perpetrator's skills and resources. Some speculated that the killers had military or law enforcement training, while others believed they were exceptionally intelligent civilians who had spent years perfecting their methods. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement noticed a shocking trend. The killers often worked in tandem. Surveillance footage from an abandoned industrial area revealed two masked figures coordinating with precision, moving in sync as if rehearsing a plan. This revelation explained the meticulous nature of the murders and the ability to evade capture. The killers were not impulsive. They were a team, each playing a specific role in executing their calculated attacks. The city's sense of safety deteriorated further as people realized that the murders were the product of coordination and planning, not random violence. Authorities increased efforts to track down the duo, but every lead ended in frustration. Homes were searched, digital activity monitored, and tips followed, yet the killers remained elusive. Residents installed cameras, locked doors, and altered routines, but the perpetrators always seemed to be one step ahead. A fear spread beyond the immediate victims. Entire neighborhoods began living under constant anxiety, watching for shadows and questioning every passerby. Even those who had no connection to the murders felt the chilling presence of unseen predators in their midst. Psychologists and criminologists were brought in to profile the killers, attempting to understand their motives and predict their behavior. They concluded that the perpetrators were highly organized and enjoyed the psychological power they held over the city. The envelopes, with their cryptic symbols, were designed to manipulate and intimidate, creating panic before any physical act of violence occurred. It was a level of calculated terror that few had ever witnessed, and the realization unsettled even the most experienced professionals. The killings also began to affect the city economically and socially. Local businesses suffered as residents avoided going out. Schools implemented stricter security measures, and neighborhoods organized patrols to protect each other. Media coverage, while informative, often heightened fear by speculating about motives and identities. Every unsolved murder deepened the sense of unease, leaving Seattle trapped in a cycle of terror and uncertainty. Despite the mounting pressure, the killers remained invisible, their plans unfolding with precision. The city's sense of normalcy had been shattered, replaced by a tense vigilance that infiltrated daily life. Seattle's residents realized that they were living under the control of highly intelligent, calculating individuals who could strike at any time. The black killers were no longer simply criminals. They had become a psychological force, manipulating fear and chaos across the entire city, while leaving law enforcement scrambling to catch up. The investigation took a shocking turn that would shake both law enforcement and the city to its core. After months of tracking leads, analyzing patterns, and following countless dead ends, detectives uncovered a chilling truth. One of the killers was someone familiar to the victims' families. This revelation sent waves of disbelief and horror through Seattle. The idea that a trusted acquaintance could be orchestrating such calculated violence challenged everything investigators had believed about the murders. Suddenly, the killings were no longer just acts of random terror. They were deeply personal, rooted in jealousy, resentment, and a long-brewing desire for revenge. As detectives dug into the backgrounds of both killers, a dark history emerged. The first killer, previously thought to be a shadowy figure operating alone, had been meticulously planning each murder for years, documenting minor grievances and perceived slights that no one else had noticed. The second killer, the one connected to the victims' families, had been silently feeding information, providing intimate knowledge of the victims' routines, relationships, and vulnerabilities. This betrayal explained the frightening accuracy with which the murders had been executed and why the killers had been able to evade capture for so long. Authorities began to piece together the relationship between the two perpetrators. They discovered that their partnership was based not only on shared skill, but also on a shared obsession with control and manipulation. The first killer executed the physical acts, striking with precision, while the second provided intelligence, carefully selecting targets and ensuring that the crimes hit their intended mark. Together, they formed a duo whose combination of insider knowledge and tactical skill made them nearly impossible to catch. Each murder was a calculated act of psychological warfare, designed to terrorize not only the victims, but also the families and the entire city. Seattle's sense of security crumbled as the revelation spread. Residents realized that someone they might know, someone they trusted, could be capable of the most unimaginable violence. Families became suspicious of friends, neighbors, and even extended relatives. The psychological impact of knowing that one killer had intimate ties to the victims amplified the fear and paranoia already gripping the city. Authorities warned the public to remain vigilant, but the damage had been done. The shadow of betrayal hung over every community, and no one felt truly safe. As investigators focused on the second killer, they uncovered an even more disturbing motive, a mix of envy, resentment, and a warped sense of justice. This individual believed the victims had wronged them in the past, often over incidents so minor that most people had long forgotten. Yet for the killer, these perceived slights had festered into an obsession. Each murder became an outlet for this pent-up anger, executed with meticulous care to send a message to the city and to the victims' families. The realization that years of planning had gone into these acts created a grim understanding among law enforcement. The killers were not impulsive. They were deliberate, patient, and dangerously intelligent. The betrayal also gave the police a crucial breakthrough. Understanding the personal connection allowed them to anticipate patterns, uncover hidden relationships, and narrow down potential hiding places. It was the key piece of the puzzle that had eluded them for months. The city's nightmare was far from over, but the revelation of a personal link to the victims brought a glimmer of hope that the killers could finally be brought to justice. Seattle's darkest chapter had revealed not just the skill and cruelty of the perpetrators, but also the frightening reality of trust, broken in the most deadly way imaginable. After weeks of intensive investigation, the police finally tracked the second killer to a remote cabin on the outskirts of Seattle. The location was isolated, surrounded by dense forests and winding dirt roads that made it difficult to access unnoticed. Officers approached with extreme caution, knowing that the individual they were confronting was not only dangerous, but also highly intelligent and capable of anticipating law enforcement tactics. The sense of anticipation was palpable, both among the officers and the city that had been on edge for months. The culmination of years of fear and planning was about to reach a critical point. Upon entering the cabin, authorities were met with a scene that was both horrifying and revealing. The interior was meticulously organized, with walls covered in maps, lists, and notes detailing every murder. There were photographs of victims, diagrams of homes, and records of their daily routines. It became immediately clear that the killers had spent years planning with an almost obsessive precision. Each detail had been recorded, studied, and incorporated into a broader strategy that allowed them to evade capture time and time again. The cabin was a chilling testament to the killer's patience, intelligence, and meticulous nature. The discovery of the cabin also revealed evidence of the second killer's role in the partnership. Documents and digital files indicated that they had been the source of insider information, feeding the first killer details about schedules, vulnerabilities, and connections. The level of personal knowledge was staggering, confirming what authorities had suspected. These murders were not random acts of violence, but deliberate, targeted attacks designed to control, terrify, and manipulate. Every aspect of the killings had been planned to instill fear not only in the victims, but in the broader community. As law enforcement prepared to apprehend the second killer, a tense standoff ensued. The individual refused to surrender peacefully, demonstrating a willingness to fight and a clear understanding of law enforcement tactics. Negotiators attempted to reason with the suspect, appealing to logic and the inevitability of capture, but the killer remained defiant. The standoff lasted hours, creating a tense atmosphere as officers balanced the need for a safe resolution with the urgency of ending the individual's ability to harm others. Every moment was a delicate calculation, a reflection of the same strategic mindset that had characterized the murders themselves. Eventually, the confrontation concluded with the arrest of the second killer, bringing a measure of closure to a city that had been living in fear for years. While the arrest did not erase the terror or undo the damage, it marked the end of the killer's reign of control. The cabin, its contents, and the meticulously documented plans provided investigators with invaluable insight into the methods, motives, and psychology behind the murders. For the first time, authorities had a comprehensive understanding of the scope and intent of the killings, allowing them to piece together the full narrative of terror that had gripped Seattle. In the aftermath, the city struggled to come to terms with the revelation of the killers' identities and methods. Families of the victims sought justice and closure, while law enforcement reflected on the extraordinary lengths to which the perpetrators had gone to evade capture. The investigation had exposed not only the meticulous planning and intelligence of the killers, but also psychological manipulation that had allowed them to control an entire city through fear. Seattle's darkest chapter had ended, but the memory of the killings, the betrayal, and the painstakingly executed crimes would haunt the city for years to come. With the arrest of the Black Killers, Seattle began the long and painful process of recovery. The city had endured months of fear, paranoia, and uncertainty, and the psychological impact of the murders lingered even after the perpetrators were behind bars. Families of the victims struggled with grief, anger, and disbelief, grappling not only with the loss of their loved ones, but also with the shocking betrayal by someone close to them. Communities that had once felt safe now viewed familiar faces with suspicion, haunted by the realization that darkness had been hiding in plain sight. Law enforcement worked tirelessly to compile evidence, analyze the killers' meticulous plans, and document the full scope of their crimes. The cabin, with its maps, lists, and detailed observations, became a focal point for understanding the duo's methods and motives. Psychologists were brought in to study the killer's behavior, revealing a chilling combination of intelligence, patience, and a warped sense of justice. One killer's obsession with minor past grievances and perceived slights explained the targeted nature of the murders, while the other's tactical skill and knowledge allowed them to execute each act with frightening precision. Together, they had created a system of terror that had gripped an entire city. The envelopes, once an unsolved mystery, were re-examined and found to contain layers of psychological manipulation. The symbols and codes were intended to create fear and confusion, turning the act of receiving a message into a source of anxiety and dread. Experts concluded that the killers had carefully crafted each element to maximize the psychological impact, demonstrating that the murders were as much about control as they were about the act of killing itself. The city had been caught in a game where fear was the ultimate weapon, and the revelation of these tactics offered both insight and a chilling reminder of the killer's cunning. Seattle's citizens slowly began to reclaim their lives, though the shadow of the murders lingered. Neighborhoods invested in better security, community watch programs expanded, and residents remained vigilant, aware that the city had been forever changed. The case also served as a cautionary tale about trust, as one of the killers had been intimately connected to the victims' families. People were forced to reconsider assumptions about the safety of their homes and the people around them, and the psychological scars of the murders remained long after the arrests. The trials of the killers brought a measure of closure, though justice could never fully erase the fear, grief, and trauma they had inflicted. Court proceedings revealed the extent of the planning, the personal motives, and the chilling efficiency with which the murders had been carried out. Witnesses recounted the impact on their lives, and experts explained the psychological manipulation employed by the duo. The city watched closely as the legal system worked to hold the perpetrators accountable, and while sentences were delivered, the memories of the crimes continued to resonate. In the end, Seattle emerged as a city that had survived terror, but was forever marked by it. The story of the Black Killers became a reminder of the dangers that can lurk behind familiar faces, and of the power of fear as a tool for control. Families mourned, communities healed cautiously, and law enforcement reflected on the extraordinary lengths required to bring the killers to justice. The legacy of the murders was a chilling lesson in patience, planning, and manipulation, a story that would haunt the streets, minds, and memories of Seattle for years to come. Even as life returned to a semblance of normalcy, the shadow of the Black Killers remained, a permanent mark on the city's history and a warning that evil can thrive where it is least expected.